Yeah, I have it leaning against. Okay, if the phone falls,
Okay.
we pick it up.
We can edit it somehow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just grab that so I can have some water.
Okay. Hello, fellas. Hope you all doing good. So I'm Farid. I'm a master's student here at the University of Alberta, doing a philosophy degree here, and I did my undergrad in philosophy too in Iran, Tehran, and so the whole idea of this videos and this recording was that I had some discussions with my friend in Iran, and we came up with this idea that maybe it's better to, have some interdepartmental relationship here with a grad student at University of Alberta and some other student at grad students, especially in University of Tehran. And one thing that I somehow find helpful was that we can have some interview discussions with some friends here and see what's their main areas of research and interest are and how they are working on philosophy. Hopefully, these audiences of this video and other upcoming videos will be more broader than just my friends at University of Tehran, and hopefully these videos will represent or give a taste of what is philosophy here in Canada and how people are doing philosophy and other things like that. And by the way, now we are at the coziest, one of my most favorite places in Edmonton is the famous cozy library of Department of Philosophy of University of Alberta. So I'm here with one of the greatest guy here, one and only Adam Jekson, and let's start the interview. So Adam, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in philosophy. Which universities did you go for your undergrad, and what inspired you to, start a really serious, pursue seriously philosophy?
Sure. So I'll start with my undergrad. I did my undergrad at Ryerson, which is now called Toronto Metropolitan University, and I started in 2017, and at that point I was interested in metaphysical questions. Metaphysics was what got me into philosophy, and I was also interested in existentialism. Throughout my university time in undergrad, my interests changed a lot, and I was pushed and pulled in a lot of different directions. So I moved from metaphysics to caring about phenomenology when I had my first seminar in continental philosophy. And at that point in my life, I was actually thinking about leaving philosophy and just not doing it anymore. I was going to go to law, and then I had a phenomenology seminar, and I thought, well, I'm going to miss out. So I kept doing phenomenology. After that is when COVID hit, and COVID was a really weird time for university. Everything was online. And that's when I got introduced to Wittgenstein, who I've basically fallen in love with. Not Tractatus, although I still like the Tractatus, but investigations and onwards, investigations, uncertainty, and sort of secondary literature around that. So most of what I want to do now will center on Wittgenstein, and my research project for my master's will likely be on Wittgenstein. Within Wittgenstein, I mainly care about his views on language, his views on metaphilosophy, and in some ways it would be called his philosophical anthropology, but to me it's really just grounding beliefs and other kinds of human actions and stuff in behavior, which I believe does have overlap with cognitive science and in activism, which also relates to phenomenology. And that's about where I'm at with philosophy. I do have side interests. I'm still interested in phenomenology and existentialism, and I have some interests in meta-ethics, but admittedly, all of those other interests are ridiculously influenced by my Wittgensteinian ways.
Of course.
So
So whenever we have some discussions with Adam, so there are always this Wittgensteinian instinct in his views that we constantly come back to and discuss it,
yeah,
and it shows itself everywhere in his
you could
views. And
you can say that I've
opinions.
internalized investigations quite a bit,
Yes,
and it sort of frames how I view the world now.
of course. So before the next session, just I wanna mention that if you can please talk a bit slower, so because maybe some guys
Oh,
in
sure.
Iran,
Yeah, okay.
it's somehow hard for them to keep track of what you're
Absolutely.
saying in that speed. Okay. So you talked about it a little bit, but you can now elaborate on it. What are your research interests and how you have pursued them, and why do you think they are important, both in terms of what are the consequences or goals of pursuing this area of research, and let's just ask it in this way: what are the long-term
Yeah, so
theoretical and practical consequences of pursuing this
Yeah.
area of research?
sure. So it's a little bit complicated, and I might sound like a broken record because like Wittgenstein, from what I've read in investigations, is saying that a lot of mistakes arise from us misunderstanding language, and that dates back to the Tractatus. So certain problems arose in the Tractatus for him, or misunderstandings in philosophy, because we misunderstood the logic of our language. And in some ways that holds true in investigations. It's just from a completely different approach. I am in line with that, I do think that. But I want to apply it to other areas. The main area that I want to apply it to right now would be moral discourse. So my views on moral discourse, roughly speaking, are that because I think Wittgenstein is right, language is a function of the social environment it is used within. Moral statements arise in the service of many different things, and I think that when people in meta-ethics, at least from what I've seen, look at moral discourse and they look at morality, they get to conclusions that I don't think follow from the sentences, specifically because they're misunderstanding the use of the sentences in a certain context. For example, if we take somebody who, you're walking down the street and you see two parents and they have a little kid. They start randomly beating up the little kid. If you are like most people, you will feel, in some sense, disgusted at that. You'll have some emotional response. And I don't want to explain this in terms of like expressivist or quasi-realist or like moral perception views and stuff like that. What you are perceiving is definitely something you don't like, and you perceive it most of the time as morally wrong. But what I want to focus on are the statements being used. So you want that action to stop. You want the parents to stop beating up the kid for no reason. Just like you can tackle them to the ground, pull them away, or yell at them, I think moral language is just another way of getting them to stop doing the action. So you basically have a variety of tools to choose from, and one of them happens to be moral language. And it's not
And
just
the
used-
moral language is not the most justified tools here. It's just another tool.
Well, I mean, it could be the most justified in the sense that, like, in this particular context, it is the most effective at getting your end goal to happen, which is mainly, in this case, getting them to stop beating up the kid. But in some cases, it might not work. And then you could use something else. So what I would want to do then with this is, really, to me, it's just running Wittgenstein through different fields and saying how these misunderstandings arise. And just to add on to this, as a really quick note, moral language doesn't just have to, like a moral sentence, like that's wrong or you're a monster, and so on. They don't have to be used in the service of getting somebody to stop doing an action. They are used like that, and they can be used like that, but they're also used to encourage people and to approve actions. And there are a variety of different uses for that. And for me, the importance of using Wittgenstein and his approach to philosophy is really to try to get people to stop doing that, to stop thinking that there's some other metaphysical realm of morality that makes moral statements true or false.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's just simply not how they're used. They're used in the service of something entirely different, which is like you running and tackling somebody to get them to stop doing the action. Both of them will work in some cases. And I could say more, but then I'd get into views about means-end relationships and like nihilism and stuff. That may be a bit complicated for a question like that.
Of course.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That was great. I had a summary of what we've been somehow talking about all these, weeks and months. So my other question is, you always answer somehow implicitly the next question in the previous question, but that's a good thing. But I pardon me if it's somehow repetitive. Answer the part that is most relevant to you. So what is your main interest or research project that you are obsessed with, and introduce some books and figures that you find somehow very helpful and inspiring for your project?
Okay, that's actually interesting. So what I've just described, I haven't found books on that, and it could easily be due to the fact that I'm just ignorant of the fact that they exist and I don't know about them and they could exist. But there are books that in some ways help to understand Wittgenstein's point with, at least I think Wittgenstein's views on language should be applied to moral discourse. There's a book that is edited by Brian McGinnis? I think Brian McGinnis. It's called Wittgenstein and His Times. And specifically, there's an article in there by Rush Rees, who's a student of Wittgenstein's and one of his literary executors, called Wittgenstein on Language and Ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And that article, in many ways, outlines Wittgenstein's thoughts on language and ritual, but more importantly, his thoughts on the interaction between behavior and language. And he does this through a couple examples. The most interesting one is when he looks at the Beltane Fire Festival. Beltane Fire Festival. It was a Scottish. He uses the Scottish version of it. It's a bit complicated to explain all of the practices of it, so I'd recommend Googling it, or using another search engine for that. And there are also some in that article. There were some remarks. The author Rush Rees, he writes about Wittgenstein's remarks on Fraser's Golden Bough. And Fraser was an early anthropologist who had I forget when he had published his book, but Wittgenstein, this is one of the only published things that Wittgenstein had in his life. In fact, I think it might have been the only published article he wrote. So it was on Fraser's Golden Bough. And he basically thinks Fraser is wrong because of his views on human behavior and forms of life and stuff like that. And so that's really helpful. Now, moral language isn't specifically talked about in that, but Rees does make a comment about how when you're in a particular culture and that culture uses a curse, not in the sense of swearing, but in the sense of placing a curse on somebody, the only reason why that statement is effective is because of the way that a curse is, one, taken up in that culture, but also, two, the role it would play in the whole host of institutions and cultures and the beliefs that are there. And it wouldn't have that same meaning in a way otherwise. Also important is that other people in the culture believe the same thing.
Okay.
So when you say it, it carries the weight because they also believe it, right? And this is very simple. You go to a different culture where they don't believe what you believe. You say something and they're like, oh, they have like a we don't believe this, right? So that would be one article.
So
there-
the book was Wittgenstein and his time.
Wittgenstein at his times. Yeah, it's
And-
published in 1982 by Blackwell Publishing, I think.
Okay.
There is one. So one other book. I haven't read this one, but so Wittgenstein in his notebooks and in Culture and Value talks about his relationship to philosophy, and he basically says I can sum it up by saying that I'm a poet.
Oh.
And Ray Monk, who wrote his biography, says that part of Wittgenstein's approach to philosophy was to have little short parables, right, which is what we see in investigations and other places, in an effort to get people to break out of a particular way of thinking, which for him would be the way of thinking that would lead to asking, at least at the time of investigations, metaphysical questions, which for him are misunderstanding language. Likewise, I think the same thing for moral discourse, right? Now, I only mention this because there's a book by a professor at Virginia Tech. His name is James Clogg. I don't know if it's Clegg or Clogg. James C. Clogg. And he has a book called Wittgenstein's Artillery, Philosophy as Poetry. And that book, in some sense, argues that Wittgenstein is just writing poetry. And in fact, in Wittgenstein's later years, when he was invited to give a lecture at one point, he agreed, he showed up, but instead it's supposed to be on logic. Instead of starting out with logic and writing stuff on the board, he turns his back to the audience and starts reading poetry. So I would recommend those, but that's nowhere near the extent of second-year literature. And there's so much stuff that I just don't know. There are over 5,000 articles and books written on Wittgenstein.
Yes, of course. So Wittgenstein and his time and Wittgenstein Artillery are the two main books that Adam
I would recommend those.
Suggest and recommend. And somehow my final question: which universities or professors do you consider, as the best match for pursuing this research project? We can even rephrase the question in a more larger scale. Which philosophical traditions or tendencies do you consider as, most or more interested in this kind of, philosophical enterprise and philosophical outlook?
That's an interesting question, and not one that's easily answered. So I'll start with professors, and then I'll move to what fields might like Wittgenstein. So as for professors,
Professors or universities?
So the author I mentioned, Clogg, he's at Virginia Tech in the States. There's also James Conant, who's written extensively on Wittgenstein and is a well-known and respected Wittgenstein scholar. He's at the University of Chicago. Hugh Price, I don't know if he still teaches. I think he's at an Australian university. And there are some professors at Oxford. There are two. I don't know. One I know isn't retired. His name is Dennis McManus. There's another one, Stephen Mullall. I don't know if he's retired. Both of them, though, write on Wittgenstein and Heidegger, and similarities between the two. It's typically similarities between the late Wittgenstein and early Heidegger. I know much less about Heidegger than I do about Wittgenstein, so I'm not going to comment on the Heideggerian stuff. They would be interesting to study under. And as far as I know, though, there isn't, at least to my knowledge, and again, I could just be ignorant of it, there isn't a professor that does Wittgenstein with moral language in the way that I'm doing. If there is, I would love to meet them. But those places are ones that come to mind when I think about Wittgenstein scholars. And actually, at Oxford is where Peter Hacker was professor for a long time. He's retired now, but he's the leading authority on Wittgenstein, both on the Tractatus and in investigations. Just as two notes about Peter Hacker. There is a very good book on Wittgenstein's tractatus.
Commentary work, you mean?
Yeah, well, in some ways it's commentary, but also refuting other arguments people are giving.
Okay.
It's called Insight and Illusion.
Insight and Illusion. Okay.
Yeah, I recommend that book. You get a very good
It's
explanation.
on investigations.
That's on tractatus.
Tractatus.
There might be stuff on investigations, but I don't think so. I think it's just tractatus. You can quickly fact check me by doing a search for it. And the other one is, he does have actually a series, very long. Each book is like 400 pages, and there are like 4 more books. It's commentary. So there's both exegesis on pretty much every remark in investigations, and there are essays on them.
Wow.
And it's by Peter Hacker and G.P. Baker, Gordon Baker. Like Oxford would be a good place. Yeah.
So, sorry, Russell and Wittgenstein, they met in Cambridge or in Oxford?
Cambridge.
They met. They were in Cambridge.
Wittgenstein went to Cambridge.
But no, Oxford is somehow the main authority.
Wittgenstein didn't like Oxford.
Yes,
He was very stiffy. I didn't mention the field. That would be useful.
Oh yes, of course.
So I mean, definitely philosophy of language, I think should take. I mean, they do study Wittgenstein of philosophy of language. I think that's very important. I think continental philosophy, specifically phenomenology, should look at Wittgenstein. And there's overlap between him and Merleau-Ponty and other philosophers. There's even overlap between Wittgenstein and Kant. Epistemology should look at Wittgenstein. Despite the fact that later in life he was a critique of metaphysics, I think that even just having Wittgenstein's perspective on metaphysics, even if you don't like his philosophy, would be nice to have. And he's also used in English programs, specifically in discourse analysis and rhetorical theory.
Oh, of course. So just a quick note that maybe is helpful. So there are some people in, social philosophy, philosophy of social science somehow, that somehow incorporated Wittgensteinian ideas into some, theories about the structure and mechanisms in social reality and construction of social reality, mainly drawing some, insights from his account of what's human nature and what is, human behavior, and how language works. So that's another area that
I remember you gave me the book on that. I haven't read that yet, so
Okay. And so another, somehow quick question. It may be also somehow ambiguous, but any comments would help. Which universities, especially, do you think are nowadays in states in Canada or in England are cutting edge in terms of philosophy of language, and they are doing some innovative works in this respect, and some students from Iran and other countries that have that are interested in philosophy of language, interested in Wittgenstein, and they are considering the possibility of pursuing their PhD or postdoc in some good universities. Which universities do you think are the cutting edge in terms of philosophy of language?
To answer it bluntly, I don't fucking know. Cutting edge in philosophy of language, I'm not sure. I like University of Chicago.
Chicago, you mentioned,
is good because James Conan is at University of Chicago. One issue with like a lot of Wittgenstein scholars, a lot of them are just dead. And like old too, right? Some of them are young. There are Italian scholars of Wittgenstein that have popped up in recent years. I haven't specifically have in mind Annalisa Kaliva and Danielle Moyle-Sherrick. And they are big proponents of uncertainty. And in fact, my own Shark was introduced to Wittgenstein through uncertainty from a literature background. And I really just don't know enough about universities to like say which ones would be good to study at or like cutting edge in philosophy of language, because there's so many other views in philosophy of language. There's P.F. Strawson, there's Grice, there's Russell, there's Frege, there's Kripke, and all of them have big followings and big things in secondary literature. So even in the book we're reading, they mentioned a rigid designator, which is Kripke.
Of course.
So I really just don't know. And that is in part because I haven't researched PhD programs yet, which I will be doing this year. So
hopefully then he will somehow give us some list, and I will hopefully share it with you of what's the result of his research been. And that's it. I think that was the questions, and if we are eagerly looking forward to your feedbacks and your reception. Which questions do you think must be added? Which question must be rephrased? And other ideas that somehow you think may be helpful to increase the qualities of this kind of interviews. Please share it with us. And just a quick part, I want to also somehow add in Persian that رفقایی عزیز، اگه حس میکنید که چیزی میشه اضافه کرد یا تغییر داد تو اینترویو یا ایده‌های دیگه‌ای که به نظرتون میرسه و حس میکنید مفید باشه رو حتما شیر کنید. حالا من اینو توی کانال یوتیوب دانشکده من یا or my universities, it's my YouTube channel name. So اونجا من شیرش میکنم و اگه خواستی میتونید تو کامنت ها مثلا بنویسین چی میخواین، یعنی چه چیزی بهتره و امیدوارم که حالا به کار بیاد. من خودم حس میکنم که تو دورانی که اندرگراد یا لیسانس ایرانو میخوندم اگه دیدهای انضمامی تری داشتم نسبت به اون چیزی که الان در فلسفه آکادمی حالا جهانی و حالا بین المللی تر داره پیش میره، شاید بهتر و دقیق تر کار میکردم رو بعضی از حوزه ها. Okay, anyways, thank you guys. Hope you all have a great education in Iran or any other country that you're watching this movie from, and goodbye for now. Thank you. Okay, so I need to
hit pause.